Well, I'm really a huge fan of portfolios of the poor. I think it just gave us so much more a realistic human view of poor people. The poor people are not the stereotype of sort of the extremely poor living on $1 or $2 a day. Every day, poor people receive their $1 or $2, and they immediately have to spend it on staying alive, food and medicine, and nothing else. What the Portfolios of the Poor book does is it shows us a much more complex view of the poor in which they have a life. They're not just passively sitting there just surviving on food and medicine. Actually, poor people have a life that they engage in lots of festivals, weddings, funerals, birthdays, just like rich people do. And for that matter, the poor people have some of the same vices rich people do. They like to get drunk on occasion, just like rich people do. First of all, the book just created this image of the poor that was much more realistic and much more human than this sort of passive victimology that is so prevalent in the aid industry. That we just see the poor as these sort of helpless, passive victims just barely staying alive. Instead, we see in Portfolios of the Poor these very resourceful people juggling many different sources of income, of credit, of savings and loans and paying back loans, and just juggling all of them at once to get through their lives, attaining their objectives, which include, not only staying alive, but also having a life. It's really so much a better realistic image for the whole aid industry to work with, because now we realize that we're not working with passive, helpless victims who are waiting for skilled, educated people from America or Europe to come save them. We're working with very resourceful people who could teach us a lot of stuff, and we're going there to help them help themselves. It's a very different mentality about aid and microcredit and everything that we do that involves poor people. We in the past have been very dogmatic and narrow about the kinds of evidence that we wanted to see to guide aid programs. That it either had to be gigantic household surveys with lots of microeconomic data, or it had to be doing statistics with large macroeconomic aggregates like GDP per capita and macroeconomic policies and GDP growth. The methodology that Portfolios of the Poor used, it's a nice mixture between getting access to reality on the ground, but still kind of keeping the standards of academic rigor. These are academics doing this research. They're very aware of academic evidence standards and of common mistakes that you want to avoid. So it's rigorous in an academic sense, but it's also much closer to kind of getting at the reality of daily life. The way we traditionally think about poverty is this hard line at like $1 a day or $2 a day to define who is the poor. Poor is people who live on less than $2 or less than $1 a day. And the kind of mental image that people have with that is that people have the same income every day. That's their income. A dollar magically arrives at the household every day. And of course, it would not require much thought to think that that's probably implausible, but the detailed research behind the Portfolios of the Poor really showed just how wildly implausible it is. That in fact, there's gigantic fluctuations in incomes and outflows and inflows of cash. And then even defining what income is extremely complicated when you're talking with people who have cash flowing in from 5 different sources and cash flowing out to 5 other sources, 5 other destinations. How do you define income? And I think what that opens up to us is more complex understanding of poverty. The idea of drawing a hard line on which one side was the poor and the other side was the non-poor was always a little bit ridiculous when you thought about it. But I think the Portfolios of the Poor made even more dramatic how infeasible and simplistic is such a hard line to define poverty. We really should be looking at a much wider range of low incomes and recognizing just how much low income is fluctuating, to be talking about the people who are materially deprived. That's a much richer concept than just this kind of rigid, simplistic, mechanical, permanent $1 or $2 a day line. After Portfolios of the Poor, I don't think any poverty line can ever be seen again in the same way that it was seen in the simplistic past. Portfolios of the Poor, by stressing how much cash flows for the poor are very volatile, I think really puts front and center the whole idea that Poor people desperately need mechanisms by which they can smooth their consumption over time. What it simply means is that at some point in time, because of the picture that Portfolios of the Poor paints of kind of, this extremely volatile inflow and outflow of cash, there are going to be some times of acute scarcity in which people might be stuck with a very desperate crisis and be unable to cope with it in terms of treating a sick child or keeping a child in school, being able to afford the uniform or the textbook or the school fee. I think Portfolios of the Poor has kind of shifted our thinking away from just thinking about the level of income to also think about the volatility of income. And once we realize how extraordinarily volatile income is, or for that matter, to use kind of a more general term, just sort of cash flow is extraordinarily volatile for people at low material income, then the need for just some kind of smoothing opportunities becomes much more obvious than it was before. I mean, before nobody really thought of, consumption smoothing, kind of evening out consumption over time. That really seemed like some kind of abstruse thing that academics care about and nobody else cared about. I think that is no longer viable after Portfolios of the Poor. We really see that it's really incredibly important. Being able to access sort of emergency cash flows in times of crisis, and then correspondingly sort of in better times, be able to access some kind of micro savings instrument to park some reserves that they can draw on later in terms of crisis. Both of these things are extremely important. Both having a place to park money during good times and having a place to get money during bad times. We now realize this is really something of the first order importance. It's no longer a kind of minor academic technicality that it used to be. This is now front and center as essential to improving the well-being of the poor.